Carnival of Lost Souls. Chapter 1, Opening. A cold wind swept through the empty fairgrounds on the outskirts of Willow Creek, carrying with it the faint sounds of carnival music. Detective Mark Hayes pulled his coat tighter as he surveyed the abandoned rides, overgrown with vines and rust. Years ago, this place had been filled with light and laughter, but now it stood decaying, a grim monument to better times gone by. As Hayes walked past the creaking carousel and boarded-up game stalls, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. The locals whispered that this place was cursed, haunted by ghosts of carnivals past. He almost believed them, with the way the wind whistled through the skeletal roller coaster tracks in an eerie imitation of screams. But Hayes was here tonight for more than just ghost stories. Over the past 2 weeks, half a dozen local teens had gone missing in Willow Creek. The only pattern was that they had all last been seen near this carnival. The police chief had written them off as just runaways, but Hayes' gut told him there was more to it. The detective tested the padlocked gates, sturdy from years of disuse. Suddenly, he paused. Was that music again, the faint sound of calliope drifting through the air? He must be imagining it, and yet, there. The lights of the carousel blinked on, its chipped horses slowly beginning to turn. Hayes stared in shock. The carnival was coming back to life. With the groan of unused gears, the roller coaster rattled into motion, cars clacking up the tracks. Down the midway, bulbs flickered alight in the game stalls, powered by an unseen hand. The very air seemed electric, filled with possibility and excitement that had long been dormant. Hayes cautiously ventured past the gate, one hand resting on his holster. The carnival was lit up in full now, looking just as inviting as it must have in its heyday. The detective hardly dared believe it. Was he dreaming? He gave himself a vicious pinch which stung sharply. No, impossibly, this was all real. As Hayes took in the impossible sight, the music swelled invitingly. From the swirling funhouse mirrors stepped a hulking bear mascot, holding balloons and beckoning him further inside. For reasons he couldn't name, the figure filled Hayes with a nameless dread. He shook it off, laughing at his own nerves. This was an opportunity, a chance to search for clues about those missing teens. Stepping onto the creaking carousel, Hayes ran a hand over the flaking unicorn he rode, its golden horn pitted with age. Children would have loved this ride, their delighted screams joining the carnival melody. Hayes could almost see their bright smiles and outstretched hands, beckoning for him to follow. The sky boiled suddenly with ominous clouds, electric scent crackling in the air as a summer storm rolled in. Wind whipped through Hayes' hair as the carousel spun faster, lights blurring hypnotically. With a crash of thunder, the ride juddered to a halt, leaving the detective reeling in the sudden silence. When Hayes climbed off, the carnival was still and dark once more, as if it had never stirred. But he knew what he had seen. Something unnatural was happening here, something that had taken those missing teens. As rain pattered the dusty midway, Hayes swore he wouldn't rest until he uncovered the truth. The game was on. Chapter 2, Investigation begins. Early the next morning, Hayes sat in Chief Dunn's wood-paneled office as rain lashed the windows outside. He recounted the inexplicable events he'd witnessed at the abandoned carnival, from the flickering lights to the phantom bear mascot. Dunn's wrinkled face was unreadable as he took slow drags on his cigarette. "I know it sounds crazy," Hayes said, "but I swear it happened. There's something not right about that place." Dunn sighed. "Damn carnival's been shut down for years. The only thing there is bored kids looking for trouble." "Chief, 6 local teens have gone missing. Don't you think it's connected?" "What I think is you've been working too hard," Dunn said. "Go home and take a few days off. I'll have McCarthy and Simmons poke around a bit." Hayes fumed as Dunn dismissed him. He knew what he'd seen, even if he couldn't explain it. And he had no intention of dropping the case. If the chief wouldn't take it seriously, Hayes would investigate alone if he had to. Back at his desk, Hayes tacked a map to the wall, plotting the locations where the teens had last been seen. Sure enough, they formed a loose ring around the outskirts of the abandoned carnival. Grabbing his raincoat, Hayes headed out. If the ride operators wouldn't talk to police, maybe they'd open up to a curious visitor. At a nearby diner, Hayes slid onto a stool and showed the waitress, Shelley, according to her name tag, photos of the missing kids. "Have you seen any of these faces recently?" Shelley popped her gum. "Can't say I have, hon, but they look a bit like some of the carnival folk that blew into town last week. Real shifty bunch if you ask me." Hayes' pulse quickened. A carnival? He tossed some bills on the counter and hurried to his car. Driving the back roads to the abandoned fairgrounds, he scanned the rain-swept pastures until he spotted it, a garish convoy of trucks and campers, clustered in a muddy field. Hunching his shoulders against the rain, Hayes picked his way through the maze of vehicles. Dour-faced workers eyed him as they offloaded rides through the downpour. At the center of it all loomed a massive big-top tent, red and yellow stripes muted by the gray sky. As Hayes approached the ticket booth, the greasy attendant fixed him with a yellowed grin. "Step right up, buddy. Come see our wonders and thrills." "I'm looking for information, actually," Hayes said, showing his badge. "Some local kids went missing near here and—" The man's eyes narrowed. "Can't help ya, pal. We just got into town." Without another word, he slid the window shut with a bang. Hayes peered through the rain-streaked window at the shadowy interior of the massive tent. Just what was this carnival hiding? He'd have to do some more digging. For now, he could feel unfriendly eyes on him as carnies milled about. Driving back through the downpour, Hayes mentally reviewed the case. A shifty carnival rolls into town just as locals start disappearing near the abandoned fairgrounds. Too much of a coincidence. He just needed to prove the connection. That night, Hayes poured through old case files and news clippings about the abandoned carnival, searching for leads. A photo of the original ride mechanics caught his eye. If anyone knew the carnival's history, it was longtime employees. Maybe some were still around. Hayes poured himself another coffee to fuel the late-night research until his desk was littered with empty mugs. He scribbled notes and muttered to himself, pinning each new clue to the web of yarn on his evidence board. Outside, the rain finally tapered off just before dawn, but Hayes was too wired to sleep. Grabbing his raincoat, he headed out the door to keep digging. He wouldn't rest until he uncovered the truth behind those teens' disappearances. The real investigation was just beginning. Chapter 3: Exploring the Carnival. The following night, Hayes returned to the rain-soaked carnival after the crowds had left, scaling the fence and creeping past the security guards. Moving through eerie patches of light and shadow, Hayes made his way towards the looming big-top tent. The grounds were still slick from the recent downpours, littered with abandoned soda cans and crumpled flyers tumbling through the gusts. As Hayes approached the tent, the drooping canvas rippled unnaturally, as if something had swiftly darted behind it. He shivered, suddenly overcome by the feeling of being watched. Peering into the shadows, he thought he spotted two pinpricks of light hovering in the darkness, eyes. Just as quickly, they vanished. Shaking off his unease, Hayes circled the perimeter, searching for seams in the heavy tarp where he could glimpse inside. But the tent was tightly sealed, offering no gaps or tears. Frustrated, Hayes scouted the exterior of the smaller tents, hoping for clues. In one, rough cots and trunks suggested transient carnival workers. Another contained only a table stacked with fake fangs, rubber bats, and jars of theatrical blood. Must be a funhouse or haunted attraction, Hayes mused. As he crept further into the carnival grounds, the smells of popcorn, cotton candy, and grilled meat still lingered in the damp air. The place seemed devoid of life, but Hayes couldn't escape the prickling sense he was being observed. The decorative canvas tents billowed and snapped in the wind, concealing anything, or anyone, that might be lurking between them. Rounding a corner, Hayes recoiled at the sight of a hideous, grinning clown face peering out at him. After a startled moment, he realized it was just a fake funhouse prop leaning against a post. Letting out a shaky laugh, he gave the ghastly painted styrofoam head a push, only to jump back as it abruptly swung on a spring, leering at him once again. Heart pumping, Hayes hastened through the carnival's zigzagging alleys, past boarded-up game stalls and more clowns leering from the shadows. Aside from the wind, an unnerving silence had settled over the grounds. The detective couldn't shake the uncanny feeling of hungry eyes tracking his every move. As Hayes neared the Ferris wheel, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Beneath the massive, spidery scaffolding, something limped between the rides. Hayes froze. A hunched, humanoid shape scuttled awkwardly into the shadows, its flesh gleaming waxy pale in the moonlight. Before Hayes could give chase, a nearby speaker crackled to life. "Step right up. Try your luck," blared a garbled, pre-recorded carnival barker's cry. Hayes jumped, nerves jangling as the voice continued hawking games and rides, accompanied by the static hiss of calliope music swelling and distorting. Whipping around, Hayes half expected to find himself surrounded by a crowd of carnival goers. But the lanes remained empty, the rides dark and motionless as the haunting music filled the air. It felt like an invitation and a warning all at once. Hayes quickened his pace through the bizarre maze of tents, props, and fences. More animatronic figures stood frozen mid-laugh or crouched giggling behind barrels, their lifeless eyes seeming to follow the detective. Heart pounding, Hayes couldn't shake the conviction that their gears might lurch to life and give pursuit at any moment. Finally spotting the exit, Hayes made a beeline for the chain-link fence, ignoring the blasts of recorded carnival sounds urging him to turn back. Scrambling over, the detective cast one last uneasy look at the shadowy grounds before hurrying to his car, determined to unravel the secrets that lurked beneath the big top. Chapter 4, Ride to Nowhere. Over the next week, Hayes regularly canvassed Willow Creek residents, digging for leads on the missing teens. Most had nothing new to offer, claiming they were just runaways or suggesting their disappearances were an unfortunate coincidence. But their eyes told Hayes many suspected the truth might be more sinister. Late one overcast afternoon as Hayes left the home of the latest dead-end interview, a scrap of paper fluttered beneath his windshield wiper. Retrieving it, he found a hastily scrawled note. "Meet at the abandoned carnival gates at dusk. Come alone. I have information." Crumpling the paper, Hayes weighed his options. It was an unorthodox contact, but he had few other leads. As a distant church bell chimed 6 times, Hayes' mind was made up. Grabbing a flashlight, he drove for the edge of town. At the abandoned fairground gates, Hayes' beam scoured the overgrown midway lined with skeletal rides. "Hello," he called out. "I'm here." Only the wind answered. Hayes checked his watch, just past 7. Had it been a prank? Then his light fixed on a figure approaching from the shadows. A heavy-set, bearded man with the hardened look of a lifetime carny. "You the cop?" the man asked in a guttural rasp. Hayes nodded, eyeing him warily. "You have information on the missing teens?" "Name's Benny. I work the circuit with Grady Brothers Carnival," Benny said. "Them kids you're looking for. They didn't run away. The rides took them." Hayes fought to keep skepticism from his voice. "What do you mean the rides?" Benny grimaced. "These rides, they got appetites. Don't ask me how. But they get turned on once a season, and they always demand a fresh haul around this time. I've Seen it happen enough to know, even if the bosses pretend it don't. It sounded absurd, the stuff of urban legend, but Hayes' detective instinct told him Benny genuinely believed it. How does it happen? How could Ride snatch anyone? You gotta see it to believe it, Benny said darkly. Come back tomorrow night, after we lock up. I'll show you. Before Hayes could ask more, Benny turned and lumbered off into the shadows. The detective weighed his story. Fantasy or not, any lead that shed light on the teen's fates was worth pursuing. He'd be here tomorrow night, ready for whatever Benny planned to show him. The following evening, Hayes arrived outside the carnival gates just as the last visitors were departing. Lurking in the lengthening shadows, he watched the roustabouts close up, dousing lights and chaining gates until the grounds were still. As true night fell, Hayes spotted Benny's hulking outline waiting by the fence. The carny glanced around before waving Hayes over. Stay close, Benny muttered. Keeping this secret got me in hot water before. They crept through the empty midway, passing motionless rides and game booths. But as they drew closer to the heart of the carnival, Hayes noticed a low, mechanical hum vibrating through the soles of his shoes. The rides were powering up. Benny led Hayes behind the massive tent, where an enormous metal scaffold held the Ferris wheel. Hayes' mouth went dry as he watched the colossal wheel slowly begin rotating, its rusty passenger cars swaying and creaking around the axis. I don't understand, Hayes said. Who turned it on? Benny shook his head, grim. Wasn't anyone human? Suddenly, the wheel's speed increased, whirling fast enough that its carriages became a blur. The wind whipped at Hayes' clothes as Benny yelled over the buzz, whatever you do, don't get on. Hayes stared in disbelief as car after car spun past in an hypnotic blur. As one neared the platform, Hayes had the dizzy sense it slowed a fraction, as if inviting him to step aboard. Shaking his head sharply, Hayes stumbled back. What the hell is happening? Before Benny could reply, a shrill whine pierced the air. An automated voice crackled from the ride speakers, please stand behind the yellow line. Keep hands, feet and belongings inside the car at all times. We gotta get out of here. Benny shouted. He turned to flee, only to halt as more deafening ride prompts blared out in a cacophony of carnival sounds. The rides were activating all around them, blocking their escape routes. They were boxed in. Hayes' pulse pounded. This couldn't be real, and yet the thundering, whirring rides seemed to be corralling them like prey. Over the noise, he heard the recorded voice continue, the ride will begin momentarily. No exiting once the safety bar is lowered. A carriage ground to a halt beside them, safety bar raised in mocking invitation. Hayes grabbed Benny's shoulder. We'll have to jump. Benny nodded. They took a few steps back, then sprinted forward, hurtling themselves through the open car just as the massive wheel lurched back to full speed. The safety bar slammed down as the wheel spun impossibly fast. Hayes clung to the rocking carriage for dear life, peering into the blur of darkness. What the hell had they gotten into? Chapter 5, Meeting the Mechanic. Hayes had no sense of time in the spiraling Ferris wheel car. Minutes or hours could have passed during their endless, whirling cycles. He and Benny sat in shocked silence, unable to see where the ride was taking them. At long last, the wheel groaned to a stop, their carriage swaying. Trembling, Hayes forced the safety bar up. As they staggered onto the platform, he noticed they were inexplicably back on solid ground again, not dangling from the ride's apex as expected. Glancing over his shoulder, Hayes recoiled. There was no Ferris wheel scaffolding, no sign of the carnival at all. Only a void of shadows behind them. What is this place? Hayes muttered. Benny shook his head, glancing around the empty platform edged by darkness. A garbled voice suddenly crackled from a hidden speaker, please gather all belongings and watch your step when disembarking. The platform ended at a short flight of stairs leading down into more shadows. Exchanging an uneasy look, the two men descended into the gloom. At the base squatted a lone ticket booth, the faded paint proclaiming, "Ferris wheel rides, $5." As they peered inside, the metal door creaked open and out stepped a wiry, grease-smeared man in coveralls. "Congratulations, you survived," he announced with a showman's gusto, resembling a carnival barker. "Wasn't sure you'd make it through in one piece, but fortune favors the bold." The mechanic's smile didn't reach his cold eyes as he looked them over. Hayes noted his name tag read, "Mr. Bridger." "Who are you?" the detective asked warily. "Where are we?" "The name's Bridger, I run the rides round these parts," the mechanic said. "As for where you are, my workshop, of course." Bridger spread his arms, and Hayes noticed the surrounding darkness was lifting like a curtain, revealing. They stood inside a massive warehouse. The space was filled with an eerie workshop containing half-built rides, spare parts, and repair equipment. Everything lay under a coat of dust, as if frozen in time decades ago. Unease prickled Hayes' neck. "What is this place? It's like no workshop I've seen." Bridger smiled coldly. "You ain't seen the likes of this place, boy. You're in the backstage now, the guts of the whole carnival operation. All the rides lead here eventually, including yours." Hayes' mind reeled. Had they traveled through some kind of portal? "Listen," he said slowly. "Some teens have gone missing near your carnival. Do you know anything about that?" Bridger scowled. "Oh, them. A regrettable mess. But the rides get hungry, they always do. I just keep the gears turning round here." Fear twisted Hayes' gut. Was this madman admitting he'd fed children to deadly rides? Beside him, Benny trembled but stayed silent. "I want you to send us back," Hayes said firmly. "And return those missing kids safely." Bridger threw his head back and barked a laugh. "You ain't got a lick of say down here, boy. The rides called you, and now you're part of the menagerie. But feel free to look around, you ain't going nowhere." Still chuckling, the mechanic wandered off into the gloom of the workshop. Hayes turned to Benny. "We need to find another way out and shut these death traps down for good." Benny gave a shaky nod. Keeping one eye on Bridger, they slowly explored the sprawling workshop, searching for any way back. Hayes examined unfinished rides and piles of scrap metal. Strange tools and machine parts littered work tables, alongside faded blueprints for rides with ominous names like the Barrel of Blood and the Widowmaker. Turning down an aisle, Hayes froze as he came face to face with lifeless animatronic figures slumped on the shelves, clowns, monsters, and glaring ticket takers with empty eyes. Hayes shuddered, unable to shake the sense they were watching him. As they ventured further, Hayes noticed a high window filtering gray sunlight. Hope leapt in his chest. "There's our way out," he whispered. "We just have to." Hayes' words died as Bridger abruptly appeared behind them. "You mugs ain't going nowhere." His eyes glinted dangerously. "But I've got a job that needs doing. Follow me." Exchanging a panicked look with Benny, Hayes reluctantly trailed after Bridger through the strange workshop. They soon came to an area clogged with massive pipework and tanks emitting a sickly green glow. Bridger gestured to a rusted valve. "Give that a crank, would ya? Pressure's been building up." Hayes hesitated, then turned the corroded wheel. A hiss of foul vapors escaped the tanks. Hayes coughed and recoiled, the air reeked of decay, like a mausoleum. "My God, what is that?" "Just releasing a bit of pent-up energy," Bridger said. "Now come on. Time you got a peek at the main attraction." Chapter 6, Dark Revelations. Bridger ushered Hayes and Benny toward a vault-like metal door on the far side of the cavernous workshop. As they approached, Hayes felt a wave of inexplicable dread. Some instinct told him that whatever lay beyond that door was dangerous. Deadly, even. Bridger spun a combination dial until the locks thunked open. As the door creaked inward, a hot blast of scorched air hit Hayes' face, carrying the stench of gasoline and burnt motor oil. Peering inside, the detective recoiled at the sight of a massive, cylindrical furnace. Smoke and sparks spewed from the stacks as the entire contraption throbbed like a monstrous metal heart. "Fires of life, I call her," Bridger declared proudly. "Powers everything you'll see at the carnival. Ain't she a beaut?" Hayes stared at the unnatural furnace. "This powers the rides? How?" Dread nodded his gut, certain he didn't want the answer. "Why, on souls, of course," Bridger exclaimed. Hayes blanched. "What? What do you mean, souls?" "The life essence of them kiddies that go missing," Bridger said casually, inspecting his fingernails. "It's the juice that keeps the ride spinning. I gotta feed the flames fresh souls every season. Like now." Revulsion roiled Hayes' stomach. This psychopath was not only abducting children, but somehow burning their very souls. It was impossible, and yet deep down, Hayes knew it was true. He thought of those teens full of hopes and dreams now condemned to eternal torment. "You're a monster," he shouted, hands clenching into fists. Beside him, Benny trembled silently. Bridger snorted. "Think what you want, but we all got jobs to do. This here's mine." He patted the pulsing furnace affectionately. Fury crashed over Hayes in a red wave. He lunged at Bridger, grabbing him by the coveralls. "You're going to shut this down and free them. Now." Bridger shoved Hayes back with surprising force. His eyes flashed with madness. "Ain't nobody leaves once they get a peek behind the curtain. The rides called you here for a reason." He turned to the furnace. "Speaking of, she's still hungry. Go fetch some fresh coal, would you, Benny?" All color drained from Benny's face. "No, please." He backed away, trembling. "I didn't know, I swear it. Have mercy." "Oh, my mistake." Bridger giggled unpleasantly. "I really gotta stop mixing up the guests and the coal." He grabbed Benny's arm in a vice-like grip. Benny wailed, struggling like a panicked animal. "Let me go. I don't want to burn." He froze as Bridger pressed a jagged blade to his throat. "But you'll burn so nice," Bridger purred. "Your soul's gonna make this baby purr for days." "Stop!" Hayes shouted hoarsely. "Don't do this." Bridger ignored him, dragging the helpless Benny toward the open furnace doors. Beyond was only fire and darkness. Soul-crushing despair flooded over Hayes, unlike anything he'd ever known. He was powerless here, they both were. Still, he couldn't stand by while this monster fed living souls to his infernal machine. With a primal yell, Hayes charged Bridger, knocking them both to the floor. Benny squirmed free as Bridger cursed and lashed out with the knife. Hayes seized his wrist, grappling desperately and ignoring the blade slicing his arm. With a final surge of strength, Hayes twisted Bridger's wrist until he dropped the knife with a scream. Scooping up the blade, Hayes scrambled clear and helped Benny to his feet. "Go!" Hayes shouted, shoving the carny toward the vault door. They fled from the furnace room with Bridger's enraged cries echoing behind them. Stumbling through the gloomy workshop, Hayes focused on putting distance between them and the madman. Once the chase seemed to give way to eerie silence, they collapsed behind a half-built carousel to catch their breath. Benny's eyes were wide with shock. You saved me. But he'll hunt us down." Hayes shook his head firmly. We're getting out of here. Spying a screwdriver on a work table, he grabbed it and set to unscrewing a nearby vent cover. This should lead to outside. You first. Benny nodded and scrambled into the duct. Hayes followed, pulse racing. He didn't know what nightmares awaited them beyond this place, but he knew one thing for certain: he was shutting down Bridger and his soul-burning carnival for good. Chapter 7: Stalked by Illusions. Hayes crawled through the lightless air ducts on hands and knees, one hand against the metal wall to guide himself. He urged Benny forward blindly, putting distance between them and the furnace room until the screams and heat faded behind them. At last Benny exclaimed he saw daylight ahead. They emerged from the ducts into hazy sunlight filtering through a dense forest canopy. Getting his bearings, Hayes spotted a dirt access road leading away from the workshop's exterior. Any idea where we are? Hayes asked. Benny shook his head uneasily. Could be miles from town. The rides don't follow natural laws. Hayes set off down the road with Benny close behind. The woods around them were eerily silent, without so much as a bird call. The trees themselves seemed to lean inward ominously as they walked, their twisting shapes reminiscent of lurking figures. They had only gone 100 yards when a blood-curdling scream pierced the air ahead. Exchanging a panicked glance, they hurried toward the sound only to find the road terminated abruptly in a sheer cliff face. Hayes peered over the crumbling edge into roiling fog far below. Another of Bridger's tricks, Benny panted. We can't trust our senses here. Uneasily turning back, Hayes felt as if the forest itself had closed in tighter around them. Let's keep moving. If we stay calm, we can outthink whatever illusions he throws at us. They pushed on through the increasingly claustrophobic trees. Hayes fought the paranoid sense they were being tracked from the underbrush. When an icy wind hissed through the leaves, he whirled around but saw nothing besides Benny. You okay, buddy? Benny asked nervously. Thought I heard something. Guess the wind. Hayes murmured. He quickened his pace anyway. Soon Hayes glimpsed a ramshackle house ahead on the side of the path. Unease prickled his neck. Moments ago, he would have sworn no building stood within miles. As they cautiously approached, Hayes noted boarded windows and wind chimes made of dangling bones that clattered eerily. The front door creaked open. From the gloom peered the pale face of a teen girl. Help, please help me, she whimpered, breaking into sobs. Hayes' blood ran cold. It was Heather, one of the missing teens. He rushed forward, only for Benny to grab his arm. It's a trick. Benny warned. Don't listen to it. Heather's face twisted in desperation. What are you doing? She screamed. Let me go. Her pleading dissolved into shrieks as she was dragged back into darkness. Every instinct told Hayes to run to her aid, but he forced himself still. Benny was right, this was some sadistic illusion. Balling his fists, Hayes turned away from the nightmarish house as her screams echoed after them. They hurried on, the forest growing increasingly alien and unnatural. Hayes' skin crawled as he noticed impossible shapes flitting between the trees, warped beings that darted out of sight when gazed upon. They're testing our nerves, Hayes muttered through gritted teeth. We just have to stay focused. But the entities lurking just out of sight seemed to creep closer, their unnatural sounds surrounding them. Hayes' heart pounded as Benny clung to him. We're gonna die in here. Benny whimpered. Bridger's monsters are coming. Quiet. Hayes snapped. Benny's panic threatened to erode his own composure. He peered desperately through the pressing woodland for any escape. Ahead, the trees finally gave way to a clearing ringed by towering pines. In the center sat a quaint carousel, its painted horses frozen mid-gallop. Soft carnival music swelled as the ride slowly began turning. Warily eyeing the shadows between the trees, Hayes led Benny toward the ride. Real or not, the carousel offered a momentary reprieve from being stalked. They just needed time to regain their bearings and plan their next move. As the hypnotic carousel turned, Hayes tried tuning out the distorting forest sounds and visions. But Benny still trembled, watching the woods fearfully. They couldn't last like this. When the music swelled louder, an idea came to Hayes. Get on the carousel, Benny, Hayes urged. The music will drown everything else out for a minute. I'll keep watch. Benny nodded gratefully and climbed aboard a frosted horse. As the ride turned, the carnival melody rose, masking the strange sounds of the forest. Hayes scouted their surroundings, alert for any sign of Bridger's illusions. But the trees remained still, even as their twisting shapes took on a sinister aspect. He knew these mind games were meant to wear them down before the real assault. They had to keep pushing forward. The carousel gradually wound to a stop, leaving Benny looking marginally calmer. As Hayes helped him down, the music faded out, allowing the ethereal sounds of the woods to resume. Just stay focused on moving ahead, one step at a time, Hayes said. Bridger's trying to panic us into making mistakes. Sticking close together, they continued following the winding path deeper into the spindly trees. Hayes strained all his senses, trying to penetrate the veil of deception surrounding them. If he could just grasp the reality beneath the facade. Ahead, Hayes spotted a rickety rope bridge spanning a mist-filled canyon. As they tentatively stepped onto the first plank, a fierce wind whipped up from nowhere. The bridge swayed perilously, ropes creaking. "Don't look down!" Hayes yelled over the gale. Eyes forward, they pushed step by step across the abyss, buffeted by winds threatening to throw them over the edge. Halfway across, Hayes felt the planks shudder beneath his feet. "It's going to collapse!" Benny cried. "We have to turn back." "Stay calm," Hayes shouted. "It's not real." Focusing all his willpower, Hayes placed one foot firmly ahead of the other. At last they staggered onto solid ground again. The bridge and canyon vanished instantly behind them. Hayes clasped Benny's shoulder, rousing his numb senses. "See? It was just an illusion. We're okay." Benny swallowed hard and nodded. But his eyes said their luck was running thin. They had survived the vision so far, but Hayes knew the attacks would only increase. How long could they cling to sanity here? Pressing on, the trees gradually turned gnarled and blackened, closing in around them. Hayes' skin prickled as the air grew thick with creeping mist that curled around their ankles like grasping tendrils. They stumbled on through the choking haze. Without warning, a bone-rattling cacophony exploded from the woods, screams, howls, and blaring carnival music all crashing together. Benny cried out, clamping his hands over his ears. "It's not real!" Hayes shouted as the bedlam reached fever pitch. Peering ahead, he glimpsed a striped carnival tent just visible through the trees. An exit from this nightmare? They ran for it, pursued by the deafening sounds until Hayes yanked back the tent flap. Inside sat a carousel and Ferris wheel, both spinning madly out of control. Towering mirrors reflected their panicked faces 100 times over. Benny crumpled to his knees, sobbing. "We're trapped, just let it end." Seeing Benny's shattered spirit, Hayes felt a swell of protectiveness. He hauled Benny up by both shoulders. "On your feet, soldier. Keep fighting. If they were going down, it wouldn't be like this." Benny managed a jerky nod. Hayes squeezed his shoulder, then turned to face their tormentors head-on. They would get free or die trying. Steeling himself, Hayes stepped back into the cacophony, toward the only choice left, confronting Bridger himself. Chapter 8, Carnival Strikes Back. Hayes pushed through the trees with Benny close behind. The forest had gone deathly still and quiet after the barrage of noise, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Hayes didn't believe they were out of danger yet. Bridger surely had worse tricks waiting for them. His suspicions were confirmed minutes later when a thunderous crack resounded overhead. Peering up, Hayes watched in horror as a massive oak tree groaned and tipped toward them, accelerating into a free fall. "Look out!" Hayes tackled Benny out of the way just as the tree smashed into the earth where they'd stood, exploding into a shower of leaves and broken branches. As the dust settled, Hayes gaped at the fallen oak nearly 30 feet thick. It would have crushed them instantly, and yet he saw no stump or exposed roots where it had ripped free of the soil. "Sorry, tree huggers, but we're onto your illusions," Hayes called out bitterly. Only silence answered. They pressed onward, skin prickling as if waiting for the next attack. It came swiftly. The ground abruptly liquefied under their feet into sinking mud. As they struggled against the clinging muck, hands burst forth to grab at their legs with preternatural strength, dragging them into darkness. Grunting with effort, Hayes managed to strike out and connect with a solid blow. The hands released him. Beside him, Benny flailed wildly before breaking free of the mud, which instantly hardened back into normal soil. "They'll have to try harder than that," Hayes panted, hiding his shook nerves. He tried to project a confidence he didn't feel, hoping to keep Benny's spirits up. Inside, dread pooled in his gut. Their luck was running thin. What horrors still lay in store? The answer came as they emerged into a derelict town square surrounded by abandoned buildings with broken windows like sightless eyes. A waiting carousel sat at the center, painted horses bobbing. Unease skittered down Hayes' spine. Carousels seemed to appear whenever the torture let up, luring them into false security. He racked his brain for their best option. "Hayes," Benny whispered in a quavering voice. "Look." Hayes followed his gaze to the carousel horses. But rather than painted plastic, these had fur coats, twitching ears, and human eyes. His stomach lurched. The horses were flesh and blood, real children warped into twisted creatures. As the ride began moving, the mutant horses screamed and wailed plaintively, bucking against the poles they were fused to. Benny sobbed, sinking to his knees at the sight. "My God, we can't leave them like this." Hayes moved toward the carousel, unsure what he could possibly do but desperate to end their suffering somehow. Their cries drilled into his skull like hot needles. From the empty buildings, a malicious laughter echoed. Bridger's voice rang out gleefully, "Still wanna play hero, boy? Go on then, put the beasts out of their misery." Grinding his teeth, Hayes grabbed a broken piece of fence post and approached the first mutated horse. Looking into its agonized human eyes, he raised the makeshift club, vowing to be quick and merciful. But at the last moment, his arms froze against his will. The illusion faltered, revealing it to be an ordinary wooden horse once more. Sneering laughter came again as the ride slowed to a stop. Shuddering, Hayes turned away. They couldn't allow despair to root in their hearts, no matter the horror surrounding them. He clasped Benny's shoulder tightly until the man's trembling eased. Their willpower was being tested to the limit. Leaving the nightmarish square behind, Hayes tried to formulate a plan. These vicious illusions were clearly meant to wear them down before Bridger moved in for the kill. If they were going to make a stand, it had to be now. Up ahead, Hayes spotted a crumbling wall surrounding the fairgrounds perimeter. Grabbing Benny's sleeve, he led them toward it, keeping to cover as much as possible. At last they reached the 12-foot wall topped with razor wire. It was an imposing barrier, but their sole chance of escape. Hayes turned to Benny. "We're going to take our chances and climb. Stay right with me." Benny's eyes were bleak, but he nodded. Hayes had nearly wedged his foot into the first crevice when an explosive roar shook the earth. From the woods charged a massive creature, crashing through trees like twigs. Tree trunk thighs and curved horns marked it as a bull, but its baleful red eyes were all Bridger's evil. There was no time for hesitation or fear. As the monstrous bull bore down on them, Hayes pushed Benny ahead, roaring, "Up, now! Don't look back!" Hayes scrambled up after Benny, shards of mortar crumbling around them as the bull's enraged bellows shook the very bricks. Hayes' muscles burned with exertion as he climbed for both their lives, vision tunneled on the razor wire gleaming just ahead. Finally hauling Benny over the top, Hayes risked a glance down. The bull was gone, only scattered turf and broken trees left in its wake. But their haven was short-lived. With an ominous groan, the brick wall itself began sliding sideways, carrying them along the perimeter. "Jump down, quick!" Hayes yelled. Benny obeyed without hesitation this time, landing in a grassy field beyond. Hayes followed, bracing for impact. Better a twisted ankle than whatever torture Bridger had planned next. Getting their bearings, Hayes saw they had reached the outer midway, though the rides were still and dark. The emptiness felt like the deep breath before the plunge. Squaring his shoulders, Hayes met Benny's frightened eyes. "This ends now. We find Bridger and finish him." Benny hesitated, then gave a resolute nod. Gripping their makeshift weapons, a splintered plank for Hayes, a jagged pump pipe for Benny, they crept through the grounds, imaginations filling the silence with horrors awaiting them. Too soon, those imaginings became real. With an ear-splitting screech, unearthly figures rushed them from all sides, skinless muscle and bone wrapped tight over distorted limbs, faces melding human and animal aspects. Gaping maws snapped as clawed hands grabbed at them. Swinging his plank wildly, Hayes knocked one creature back, only for two more to take its place. Beside him, Benny screamed hoarsely, lashing out with his pipe at the things trying to drag him down. There were so many. "The funhouse, go!" Hayes shouted. Grabbing Benny's sleeve, he carved a path through clawing hands while landing knockout blows. Step by agonizing step, they battled toward the glowing funhouse doors until half-crawling over the threshold and slamming them shut against the creature's wails. Slumping against the door, Hayes gulped air into his burning lungs. Benny sobbed dryly, his weapon clattering to the floor. They were at the end of their tether, too exhausted to cry or panic anymore. Hayes gripped his partner's shoulder, seeing the surrender in his eyes. "Stay with me, Benny. We end this together." Benny managed a weak nod. Using the last of their strength, they helped each other back to their feet and turned to face the twisting maze of mirrors and terror awaiting them. Each step deeper echoed with the mocking laughter of Bridger. Around every corner, their own frightened reflections stalked them, two mice in a sadistic labyrinth with no cheese at the exit. Only a cat with a toothy grin. Somewhere ahead, distorted calliope music swelled. Gripping their weapons, Hayes and Benny moved toward the sound. As they entered the Hall of Mirrors, their multiplied images flashed by in fractured glimpses, running, limping, faces drawn in silent screams. The mirrored maze stretched on endlessly, but Hayes no longer tried to reason their way out. Each corridor led closer to Bridger. Sweat stung his eyes, adrenaline and fury clipping his senses to the here and now. Find the monster. Kill it. That was all that remained. At last they reached the heart of the warped funhouse. The music source came into view, an old decorative organ littered with pipes and switches. Sitting at the keys swaying along to the chords was a hunched figure in faded overalls. Bridger. Gnashing his teeth, Hayes charged ahead, weapon raised over his head. A small distant part of himself pleaded no, but that voice was easily snuffed beneath violence and vengeance. With a guttural cry, he smashed the plank down on Bridger's back with all his rage. There could be no mercy for monsters. Bridger collapsed face-first onto the organ keys with a discordant wail, oozing dark liquid onto the floor. Chest heaving, Hayes turned to see Benny fall to his knees, reality sinking into his numb mind. They had survived the nightmare. It was over at last. Chapter 9, Truth of the Entity. Hayes stood over Bridger's unmoving body, emotions seesawing wildly between shock, horror, and savage satisfaction at seeing the monster laid low. Benny sank to his knees, sobbing with relief it was finally over. Steeling himself, Hayes rolled Bridger's body over, ready to confront the madness in his eyes one last time. But the face staring vacantly up at him was a stranger's, just a blank canvas of flesh. Not a mark on him from the deadly blow. Hayes recoiled. It's not him. Just another illusion. Benny cried out in despair. Hayes' moment of vicious victory turned to ash in his mouth. They were still trapped in Bridger's sadistic maze. Vents in the ceiling abruptly spewed clouds of foul smoke, choking off their breath. Benny crumpled into a fit of hacking coughs. Grabbing his partner, Hayes staggered blindly through the haze until he collided with a paneled wall that gave way to reveal a dark passage. They collapsed inside, gasping the stale air. As their coughing subsided, Hayes groped around the small chamber. A storage room of some kind, its shelves lined with strange machinery and marked bottles. Leaning against the cold concrete wall, Hayes' fury melted into exhaustion. He had nothing left, physically or mentally. But Benny trembled anew with terror. They couldn't quit, not when Bridger still stalked them. Hayes squeezed the man's shoulder firmly until the trembling eased. Just as Benny had jolted Hayes from despair at the carousel, now it was his turn to be the rock. "Stay with me, brother," Hayes urged. "We're getting out of this pit together." Benny managed a shaky nod. They leaned silently against each other, summoning the last scraps of fortitude remaining in their battered souls. When their breathing steadied, Hayes rose and helped Benny up. It was time to end this. Creeping from the storeroom, they moved cautiously through the emptying corridors, smoke dissipating overhead. As they walked, Hayes pondered the illusions meant to break them. Why construct such elaborate ruses for two strangers? Unless the horrors weren't for them at all. They were for Bridger. Hayes froze as the truth struck him. It's feeding on him. What is? Benny rasped. The entity behind this place. It needs Bridger's fear and pain to survive. Bridger wasn't the master here, he was as much a prisoner as them. Fresh determination swelled in Hayes' chest. There was still an innocent to save here, no matter how twisted. Pressing deeper into the warped funhouse, they began to hear echoes of distant crying and screaming. Benny recoiled, but Hayes urged him on. It's Bridger. We have to reach him. The screams amplified until they entered a mirrored chamber draped in red velvet. Black lacquered boxes lined the walls, lidded shut. Muffled pounding came from within one as a child's panicked voice cried out. "Please, let me out. I'll be good." Hayes jimmied the box open to reveal a 10-year-old Bridger, knees hugged to his chest. As Hayes reached to comfort the boy, he blinked and became the adult Bridger once more. It preys on his childhood trauma, Hayes realized aloud. Bridger's eyes flashed with agony and rage. "You don't know nothing," he snarled. "I keep it fed, I keep it happy. It promised I'd never have to go in the box again." Bridger trembled, seeming to war internally with himself. Hayes knelt beside him. "You don't have to live in fear anymore. We can end this." Bridger stared back, hesitation creeping into his eyes, before they hardened into iron resolve. "No. "It'll never let us go," he rasped. "Best I can do is make your end quick." Bridger launched himself at Hayes, grasping for his throat. They grappled violently until Benny seized Bridger from behind. As they struggled, the mirrored walls and velvet melted away, replaced by rusted chains and grated metal like an enormous cage. Hayes broke free and helped Benny wrestle Bridger into a restraint. As they secured the bonds, Bridger thrashed and wailed for mercy. Looking up, Hayes saw they were once again in the core furnace room, flames roaring hungrily. But rather than scrap metal, child-sized bundles moved along the conveyor belt toward the fire. The true horror sank roots in Hayes' heart. This was no illusion. Each bundle skirmed and cried softly for their mothers. Hayes turned to pull them back, only to find his hands pass through their substance like a ghost's. "It's feeding the furnace fresh souls," he croaked. Bridger sagged in his chains, letting loose a wretched, broken sob. "I tried appeasing it, but it always wants more. Forgive me." Hayes grasped Bridger's shoulders firmly. "It's not too late. Tell us how to stop this." Bridger shook his head. "Ain't no stopping it. The beast lives in the heart of the furnace, where the flames burn hottest. Ain't nobody survived facing it." He lifted his eyes to gaze at the bundles steadily moving toward oblivion. "Best we can do now is get these poor souls out quick." Hayes looked helplessly at the children drifting past. Even if they managed to halt the conveyor belt, the furnace doors remained sealed. Was all hope lost? "I'll distract the thing," Bridger said grimly. "Maybe give you boys a chance to pry open the doors." Before Hayes could respond, Bridger broke free of his bonds with unnatural strength and strode toward the towering furnace. He gazed up at the roaring towers of fire and spoke in a booming voice. "All right, you ornery cuss, I got your meal." With that, he hurled himself straight into the inferno. Hayes shielded his face against the explosion of flames and heat. Squinting into the blaze, he glimpsed the silhouette of a gargantuan creature writhing and thrashing within the furnace. Seizing the opportunity, Hayes and Benny rushed to the sealed doors. The metal scorched their hands as they pried at it, screaming from the pain but desperate to save the children. With a deafening groan, the doors cracked open. Hayes reached in, feeling the waves of flames searing his skin, and grabbed the nearest bundle, dragging it to safety. Again and again he plunged back, Benny helping drag them out until the conveyor belt was empty. As the last child cleared the threshold, an unearthly howl shook the room, and the doors slammed shut once more with force that dropped Hayes to his knees. Inside the furnace, the dark shape swelled and contorted in fury at its lost feast. But they had done it, the children were freed. They huddled together in a corner, dazed and traumatized but miraculously unburned. Sobs of relief escaped Hayes and Benny. "We did good, brother," Hayes said. "Whatever comes next, we did good." A blood-curdling scream came from the furnace, shaking dust from the rafters. The shadowy entity, whatever monstrosity it truly was, smashed against the walls of its prison, howling for the lives that had evaded it. Hayes clung to Benny as the room quaked around them. But to his astonishment, he realized the quaking came from above them, not the furnace itself. The metal walls and ceiling were shuddering, dust raining down. Cracks zigzagged across the surface as metal beams groaned. Hayes' eyes widened in sudden realization. It's the workshop falling apart without the furnace running. This whole nightmare world is coming down. Frantic, Hayes turned to herd the children toward the exit. But before they could flee the collapsing building, the ceiling split open. Hayes glimpsed a blinding stab of natural sunlight just as tons of debris caved in on their heads. Then the world went dark and silent. Consciousness returned slowly to Hayes, accompanied by throbbing pain. Coughing gritty dust from his lungs, he shoved aside slabs of metal and wood, pinning him down. All around was the wreckage of the collapsed warehouse. Benny lay nearby, grimacing and nursing his arm but otherwise intact. Together they helped dig out the dazed children from the rubble until everyone was accounted for. By some miracle, they had weathered the destruction. Shielding their eyes from the harsh sunlight, they staggered from the ruins through desert scrubland. No sign remained of the nightmarish carnival grounds. Only miles of empty wilderness stretched before them. They were alive. They were free. The demon's playground had crumbled at last, its prisoners released by courage in the face of evil. Arm in arm with Benny, Hayes led the children onward toward hope. Chapter 10, Final Confrontation. Hayes gazed around at the group of stunned, disoriented children they had rescued. Their eyes held the hollow look of ones who had gazed into an abyss few could comprehend. Softly, he spoke. "I know you're scared and confused right now. We all are. But the worst is behind us. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." The children managed shaky nods, clinging to one another for comfort. Hayes knew the road ahead would be long for them. But for now, just taking one step at a time away from that unholy place was enough. Benny approached Hayes, face etched with grief. "Do you really think it's dead for good? That thing back there?" Hayes clapped a hand on his shoulder. "It's gone. We stopped feeding its souls, let the fires die. Nothing can survive that." Saying it aloud bolstered his own flickering hope. For hours they trekked through the wasteland, until the children could go no further. As the sun dipped low, they made camp between two large boulders that provided sheltered nooks and crannies. The little ones curled up quickly, emotionally spent. Hayes tucked his jacket around a small boy and ruffled his hair. Just days ago, these children had been laughing and playing, never dreaming of the horrors ahead. Hayes swore to himself that they would know peace again. He and Benny took first watch, huddled by a meager fire. The desert night air held a new chill now that the demon's furnace was extinguished. Rubbing his arms, Hayes peered out into the darkness, alert for any threat. But nothing stirred out there. Only their own echoes haunted them now. Later, Hayes woke to Benny shaking his shoulder urgently. "Someone's out there," he whispered. "I heard noises, getting closer." Instantly alert, Hayes gripped his makeshift club and moved to the cave entrance. He strained his eyes into gloom. Had some entity from that unholy place tracked them? From the shadows shuffled a hunched figure. Hayes braced himself, weapon raised. As the shape entered the firelight, he froze. "Bridger." The man's overalls still smoldered from the furnace. His gaze no longer held the fanatical gleam but only bone-weary defeat. He looked diminished. Haunted. "Stay back," Benny warned, holding a flaming brand between them. Bridger sank to his knees at the edge of their camp. "Let me speak my piece. After, I'll go and trouble you no more." Hayes hesitated. What fresh lies could this demon puppet spew? But he saw only regret in Bridger's eyes now. Slowly Hayes nodded. "Say what you came to." Bridger fixed his gaze on each child in turn. "I failed you," he rasped. "Let greed and fear damn my soul. Nothing I say can undo it. But it's you kids that are the true heroes. Your souls shone so bright, the evil couldn't stand it. Your strength freed us all." The children stared back silently, some with tears glistening in their eyes. Bridger gave a slow nod, as if this was the response he expected. "You got real metal in you," Bridger told them. "Hold to that goodness, children. Don't turn out like me." He lowered his head, sobs racking his frame. Hayes felt Benny stiffen in outrage, but he gripped his friend's shoulder. There was no more malice left in this broken man. Only shame. Redemption ain't beyond any man seeking it sincerely, Hayes said slowly. Stay. Help care for these kids. That's how you start making amends. Bridger looked up with fragile hope in his eyes. You'd let me join you. Hayes held his gaze. I reckon we've all touched darkness lately. What matters now is where we walk from here. The children shifted nervously but made no objection. Bridger hesitated, then gave a small grateful nod. I'll not waste this mercy. As Bridger awkwardly helped get the children settled again, Hayes kept watch outside. He breathed deeply the cool night air, free of smoke and screams. The coming days would not be easy, but evil no longer loomed over their souls. That alone was a blessing. At dawn, they set out again across the wastes. Hayes led the band, scouting the terrain and setting a steady pace. Benny coaxed the children on with songs and stories. And Bridger lingered at the rear, carrying the weaker ones when they grew tired. The ragged group moved slowly but steadily, the children's spirits lifting. They crested a rise and spotted a distant ribbon of highway, their path back to civilization. Their quest was almost over. Kneeling, Hayes addressed the children. We made it together. You all showed courage that would shame grown men. Remember that strength, and you'll overcome anything life throws at you. The children hugged Hayes fiercely, tears dampening his shirt. Even Benny had to wipe his eyes. Didn't know you were such a softie, he chuckled. Hayes just smiled, too moved to speak. As the group turned toward the distant road, Hayes grasped Bridger's arm. Thank you. For showing me even demons can change. Bridger lifted his gaze to the sun breaking over the horizon. The light still finds cracks to shine through. Long as we see it, there's hope. Together they walked on, shadows fading behind them.